All right. So, for tonight, tonight's kind of an odd message because it's not something that gets talked about a lot. And we're still technically in the series of like messages about the arsenal. But this is not necessarily something that's an arsenal thing, but it is at the same time. It's more tactical, I guess. More, I don't know, I guess we'll just talk about it and see where the chips fall. So, a lot of us are familiar with the concept of cycles. And a lot of us, when we think of cycles, we think of things like in Ecclesiastes, where, where Solomon writes about how there is a time for everything. And a lot of Christians refer to that as seasons. There are times where things happen, and it's like for a season, for a cycle of time, things are meant to kind of happen in this kind of like way, or we're meant to go through a period of trial or a period of growth or different things like that. But then there are other cycles as well where there are things like patterns of development or patterns of behavior, and that's kind of more what we're on tonight. Because see, the thing about it is that a lot of things happen in patterns. And we're going to glance at one particularly ugly verse, but it is what it is. Let's see here. So in 2 Peter 2, Peter writes, "These people are springs without water and mists driven by a storm. Blackest darkness is reserved for them, for they mouth empty boastful words, and by appealing to the lustful desires of the flesh, they entice people who are just escaping from those who live in error. They promise them freedom while they themselves are slaves of depravity. For people are slaves to what has mastered them. So, if they have escaped the corruption of the world by knowing our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and are again entangled in it and are overcome, they are worse off at the end than they were at the beginning. It would have been better for them not to have known the way to righteousness than to have known it and then to turn their backs on the sacred command that has passed on to them, or that was passed on to them. Of them the proverbs are true. A dog returns to its vomit, and a sow that is washed returns to her wallowing in the mud." The thing about it is that for context purposes, Peter's kind of talking about false prophets. I mean, he talks about it earlier on. But the thing about it is that what we're kind of looking to highlight here is this. Is the way that there are times, and we're going to kind of go over this a little bit because it's kind of a big thing. See, a lot of us, we read a verse like that, and out of context, Peter's saying some stuff that has some pretty significant connotations. It's almost like he's saying, oh, If you were saved and then you fell away from God, or if you went back to your old sins, you may as well have just never been saved. And we read that, and that sounds extremely damning, because it's a very hard thing to have to kind of look at. It's a hard thing to have to consider that, we can end up in spots where we're at odds with God in such a way, or where we're effectively a lot of us can read into it that we're losing our salvation in those occasions. But that's not really what he's saying. He's saying effectively that, but he's referring to people who have had a greater connection to God. A lot of the people who read that chapter or read those verses and kind of look at them and are scared of them are the people who don't have the connection with God that he's referencing. They're kind of just he's talking about people who have really known, who have really been saved. For context purposes, there was no nominal church at that point in time. You couldn't just... people didn't worship the Bible because there was no Bible. And I know that that's a thing to say, but there's a lot of people nowadays whose entire relationship with God is what they read about him, and it's not actually anything personal. So you have these people who don't have a personal relationship with God, afraid that if they fall into sin after they've been saved, they're going to be what Peter's talking about, when Peter's really talking about false prophets, more specifically, and false teachers, and kind of just people who are wicked within the church. And not wicked in the sense that they fall, but wicked in the sense that they were never really saved, or that they turned around and tried to make their relationship with God into something that they could control, into something that they could use. He even goes on to talk at an earlier point about angels, and the way that these people will heap blame on celestial beings or abuse on them, and they don't throw anything back despite the fact that the angels are stronger. There's a whole thing here, but it's an interesting one to discuss, because when we're talking about cycles of behavior, we have to kind of delve into this a little bit, because how do you end up with somebody who's saved by God, has a legitimate experience with Christ? Because that's what they had at that time. You look at the examples of people being saved in the Bible, in Acts, and post Jesus, post his death and resurrection, and a lot of them are just crazy stories that we don't see in a lot of the church these days. Peter goes to Cornelius's house and starts praying with them, and immediately people are speaking in tongues and prophesying and all this stuff, and the Holy Spirit breaks out. Most churches, it's considered a good night if some people come up and pray for forgiveness and pray for salvation, and that's it. That's our marker. So how does it come about that we can have instances where these people who are having experiences like a Cornelius or like a day of Pentecost, even some of the ones who were saved as Paul kind of went around the Mediterranean there and planted churches, there were a lot more stories of just feats of God from him casting out demons to healing people, giving prophecies. So at that point in time, in that context, we have Peter talking about people who had relationships with God and then turned back. These were people who saw those things, experienced those things, did those things, and they still turned around. It's kind of the same way that Judas Iscariot walked with Jesus, and he still chose to betray him. And yeah, he had a demon come into him the devil overtook him at one point. That's true. Also, he was open to it. Like, he was willful on this matter. He was able to serve as an open vessel. See, the thing about it is that some of us, we live in patterns. We live in cycles. And there's a lot of different kind of ways that it looks. There are, we'll kind of start with like generational stuff. There's actually an interesting little verse in Ecclesiastes 1. If Ecclesiastes was not a small book, hidden between larger books, it would be splendid and easy to find. There we go. Come on. All right. So in Ecclesiastes 1, verse 4, Solomon writes, "Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course." All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Solomon writes this thing and just like highlighting this reality of like things kind of coming and going, like in consistent fashion. And we could talk about seasons, but that's not really our thing. Because see, the thing about it is that for a lot of us, cycles exist in our personalities or in our minds, in our hearts. And one of the things about it is like the generational thing. A haunting reality is to consider like how much like our parents we are, how much we carry from our parents, and how much we learn from them. And on the one hand, you could figure that maybe you're just taught stuff. Like if you're around your parents, you'll learn. But then you have all these instances of people who were raised by families that were not their birth parents. And they exhibit behaviors specific to said parents. But the thing about it is that the generational aspect is something that is a very problematic thing. When we talk about cycles, we have to consider like the reality that some of us are in generational cycles. Where sin and generational curses is a word that we use, but really it's a cycle of behavior, of repeated behavior that moves from one family member to the next family member. You also have familiar spirits, which are demons that specifically will like cling on to a family in order to enforce those generational curses. So for example, like you might, if you look at your family line, it can be a really daunting thing to look at how many people in your family have a history of divorce. For example, I know that for my family, on my mom's side, there is a long history of divorce. My mom's been divorced many times. My grandmother, my direct grandmother, was divorced many times. Her mom was divorced a couple of times. And then following down that line, and then it gets a little foggy from there. I can't remember, because that grandmother was Native American. She grew up in the tribe, and the grandfather who married her was from Syria, and we don't actually know a lot about him or where he came from or anything about that. But the thing about it is that, like, you can trace the lines back and see it happening, and you can see the repetition. Also, from my mom's side, just as an example, you have like abusive relationships. My mom was in multiple like abusive relationships. My grandmother was in multiple abusive relationships. Her mother, yeah, like it just goes down that line. So you can see this kind of like thing of where the generations just kind of go. And actually, I need to redact one thing. My grandma's mother was not the one who got divorced and was in abusive relationships. She was the one that stood out. It was her grandmother. So my grandma's grandmother who had that. It's almost like it skipped a generation in a way, but not really. So, we just have these things that we kind of have to consider, like the way that our family carries on. Generational things that move from one family member to the next family member, and so on. And that's something to look at. It's something to weigh. It's something to consider. But you can kind of see how this pattern exists, and how sometimes you will have a certain proclivity towards a thing. Like you might have a kind of genetic, for lack of a better way to say it, a sort of genetic weakness to one kind of sin or another. And that's either, whether it's nature or nurture or a combination of both, it doesn't matter because it's there. Another kind of cycle thing comes from behavioral patterns. Certain kinds of things, or actually, no, yeah, it's fine. Another kind of cycle that we go through is behavioral patterns, and in those behavioral patterns, there are things that we will kind of move in a direction, and then default, and then we'll get trapped in our default setting. And sometimes it's not even necessarily that it's a default setting; it's just kind of like a low mode. You'll kind of like have periods where you kind of ebb and flow, where you have highs and lows in terms of how you're living, and you'll recognize that the pattern comes about under certain circumstances. And there's a lot of different stimuli that can be. That can be things like, interactions with their family. That can be things with like, just times of the year. Sometimes what feeds into it is actually trauma. There are even cycles of trauma that can happen. It's what psychologists will refer to as body memory, where your body will remember trauma, so you'll have anniversaries. So every year, around the time of certain like big, bad, traumatic events, you'll start to behave differently. So you'll have periods of like you'll have periods where, like, let's say that you had like a car crash, for example, in March. Sometimes you'll have instances where around that same time in March, second or third weekend, we'll say. And if it was particularly traumatic, you'll have body memory that comes and haunts you during that period of time. You'll just be anxious, or you'll be more on your guard with other cars. You'll feel paranoid. You'll feel like aspects of your personality shift and you don't know why.
And even if you don't remember what
Mm-hmm.
happened,
Even if you don't remember it happened.
I think that happens to me a lot too.
Yeah. It's one of those things, like, a lot of people don't really realize it. They don't recognize, like, it's not a commonly known thing. But it can be a contributing factor to, like, us struggling in life and different things. So when we're, like, living our lives as followers of Jesus, you know, there are stimulus out there that can, like, kind of push us in a direction. You know, and it's not even just that. Like, sometimes we'll just fall into cycles of, like, kind of ebbs and flows in terms of, like, our how our minds work. In Ephesians 4, let's see here, where is it? Our exact verse. There it is. Ephesians 4:14. Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people within their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Now, I'm pulling that a little out of context at the moment because I'm kind of trying to get through this, but because this is kind of just the introduction here, just kind of talking about, like, framing what we're talking about, these patterns, these cycles, these things that kind of, like, come up. And sometimes what it is it's about, like, teaching. Sometimes you'll ebb and flow as you kind of try to find the next thing that, like, fills the need for you to have, like, a spiritual something. And you have some people where they kind of, their cycle looks like going from one place to another, to another, to another, and then back again, as they kind of, like, try to grab onto the things that they need in life, and they try to pull into that. And that can be really problematic in and of itself. You have some people where they'll find, like, hobbies and different things like that they'll grab hold of. A lot of people in church will have, like, certain teachers or so on that they'll kind of bounce around between, or lessons that they'll bounce around between, as there's something in their soul that needs to, like, grab a hold of this, but they can't quite do it. And they get distracted by the next thing, and they just kind of move back and forth. I know that when Paul writes this, he talks about the deceitful scheming of men, and that is a thing. Some of us have a certain weakness to authority. Like, we will just take, every time that we hear something provocative, we'll just, like, say, oh my gosh, you know, I need to go for that. And suddenly you're just like, oh, this is new, this is refreshing, this is different, this is interesting, and you're just like, oh, this is good. And then you, like, kind of, like, feed on that for a bit. And then when it starts to feel a little, when the uniqueness of it starts to kind of fade, you'll get grabbed by the next thing. And there are people who know how to create false doctrines and false narratives, and they'll lure you into those places. And it's not just people. Like, there is one other verse here to kind of look at before we kind of, like, dig really deep here. Let's see, it is Ephesians. Or am I meant to be in Galatians? No, Ephesians, there it is. Put on the full armor of God, Ephesians 6:11. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So that, the statement about the devil's schemes and being able to stand up in the face of that is kind of a big deal, because a lot of us kind of struggle to recognize that, like, in that verse, the proper definition of schemes is deceitful scheming, deceitful schemes. There's a thing there where Satan, it's highlighting this point about how Satan very much so is always thinking of ways to try to destroy us. He's always coming up with plans for how to break us down, for how to affect God, for how to hurt him. And sometimes we are the means by which he does that. And the thing about the devil is that he chooses the demons to assign to us based off of our weaknesses. So let's say, for example, and just to kind of bring it all together and kind of bring the whole picture together, let's look at this from this perspective. You have a generational weakness, a proclivity towards, we'll actually use divorce as our example because it's a big one. And it's one that I personally know. So you have this thing where you have been taught since you were young, there's a thing about divorce in your family, right? Because a spirit has attached itself to your family and to reinforce this idea that divorce is a normal thing. It's not even that it's a normal thing, it's that sometimes it's a necessary thing because love isn't always real. Love isn't always enough. Love isn't always permanent. So, number one, that sets you up to accept love that is not complete, that is not real. That sets you up to accept love that is passing. It makes infatuation and love a harder thing to tell apart. So you have to be very careful at that point. So there's already one little weak chink in your armor, right? And that's been crafted, that's been molded. And that way they can kind of steer you into bad relationships that fulfill parts of things that they can then use against you. But then that also feeds into the divorce thing because now you can, if they've steered you into a bad relationship and you get married, they can now use that in order to try to bring up those old feelings of thinking, well, that hardness that says divorce is fine. And as a result, they can then use that to put you into a place to continue the cycle. And the devil will choose demons who have already been assigned or will assign demons who can foster that even more so. So like your Jezebel spirits who will create division, your spirits of fear who will linger there and just feed you ideas about your partner not loving you or not caring about you or cheating on you, or demons sent to your partner, your husband or wife, in order to get them, to tempt them to cheat on you or do whatever it is that's necessary. Or they're going to direct you to somebody to start off with who's already got a tendency towards cheating. There's a whole thing here. There's a whole plan. And they're going to generate this cycle that they're going to repeat again and again and again because they know what your weakness is. So if the devil comes at you with this and sets up this whole thing, let's say that you end up in this relationship, but you don't want a divorce. You don't want to believe in divorce. You want to believe in love. You want to stay with this person who you love. And maybe they're not a bad person. Maybe they love you back. Maybe they absolutely do. And maybe they're fighting because they also know God and they're fighting hard to stay with you. So you find yourself in this place, but you have weaknesses created by what you grew up with. So the generational stuff, the familiar stuff, and now you also have these things where they're in your head, throwing things at you. And the devil knows, Satan knows how to accuse you. He knows how to set you up. So it's this thing where it's okay, well, I know that this thing has been built into them. We have crafted this portion of their psychology. We have built it into them. So now what do? Well, we're going to push that button again and again and again. Push that button of untrustworthiness, where they're not going to trust their partner. They're not going to trust their partner. We're going to keep pushing that button because it's already there. They already don't know that they believe their partner loves them. So we're just going to keep pushing that button in order to get them to believe they don't. Oh, but the partner fights back. Oh, but the person fights back. Okay, well, fine. We'll just distract them somewhere else. We'll go ahead and we'll distract them with other things. How about work stuff? How about life stuff? How about other things that we've crafted through the other side of their family? How about stuff with their partner that makes things difficult for them? Or what if we just attack their husband or wife? And then we'll put them in a spot where now they're difficult. And now we pull back, and now we have a chance to put them back in that place of thinking that their partner doesn't love them. Their spouse doesn't love them. And now we push that divorce button again and again and again. That's how they do. These are the cycle. This is a example. And I know it's like a little convoluted, but that's actually how it is. It's convoluted. You don't, a lot of us don't recognize the links to which the enemy goes to plan in order to reap our destruction. Because the thing about it is that if they can get you to have a family and then divorce and then break everything off and suddenly your family is scattered, they've just damaged so many people all in one shot. It's why when Jesus talks about when he highlights different sins, he oftentimes goes to the most extremes, right? So when he says, if you look at somebody in lust, then you've already committed adultery. Why does he say adultery? Is adultery the worst sexual sin that you can commit? Or are they worse ones? Well, from the perspective of God, adultery is the worst. We don't believe that as physical people, because there are worse things. But from God's perspective, adultery is the thing that he hates the most. And that's something that you find in the Bible over and over again, as it was something that he had to personally experience as he tried to love Israel and then love us after. So this whole thing about these cycles that are crafted and molded and built in, and it's all there. And then maybe, if they can inspire some trauma, then they can have you reliving that over and over again. Spirits of trauma will come in and afflict you, and they'll just linger there and bring those memories back and those intrusive thoughts. And they'll kind of put you in a spot where again and again they can just push those buttons. They can push those buttons in order to try to get you into places and throw you off. Because that's the cycle. When I worked for that side, when I was a Satanist, that was something that I was taught to do, was to keep people off balance. You keep people off balance by finding the angles to afflict them. I was even trained by the demons who trained me to manipulate people and so on. I was trained to go around people's defenses. So if you find an angle, but it'll work, you go for it, test it out, and see what happens. If it doesn't work, if they rebuff you, then you work around it until you can chip at their defenses, until they lower the shields in that spot, and then you can come back to it and hit them in that spot. That's how they attack. That's how they manage us. They spend their time. And when we talked about when we went through the deliverance series, we talked about different demons and how, some of them are patient. Some of them will linger. Some of them will sit with your family one generation after the other in order to foster the generational, what we refer to as the generational curses that our families will have. If you have a family where anger issues are a thing, there's oftentimes a spirit of rage or some form of spirit of division that will have been assigned to your family. And that spirit will follow members of your family around in order to try to inspire this thing. They will foster a a culture of rage in your family in order to create the anger issues necessary. It's the kind of thing where they'll cause your dad to blow up and become this rage monster. And then they'll come to you while you're reacting to it, and they'll lie to you about it in order to get you angry and raging. Well, if you were just stronger, then you could beat him up. If you were just stronger, then you could do it. Oh, he deserves to be put in his place. He deserves to be beaten up. He deserves to be hurt. Look at the way he's hurting you. Look at the way he's hurting your mom. Look at the way he's hurting your family. These are the kinds of things that they'll tell you in order to try to inspire that same thing in you. So then you grow up with all this anger and bitterness and rage that they can then use for their own measures. And then when the day comes and you finally blow up at your own family, they just repeat the cycle. Because they'll go to your kids and they'll say the same stuff. These patterns are a thing that we have to understand as followers of Jesus, because they will have an effect on our ability to follow him. And the thing about it is like reading that verse from 2 Peter, it's brutal in so many ways. But this is how people get in those places. This is how you can have like a point where you're saved. You hit that moment. You have that time with Jesus. And I'm not talking about like you go up to the pulpit, you say a prayer, and the pastor tells you you're saved. No, I'm talking about full on like the Holy Spirit moves and you're speaking in tongues and you've had somebody heal you and prophesy over you and you're just blown away. You give your life to Jesus and you start speaking in tongues and start laying hands on the sick and stuff. Things get crazy. You have like a full-on experience with God. This is how you can end up in a place where you end up going back on it. Because sometimes the cycles and the patterns, if we're not wise to them, they can take us back. They can keep us they can stunt our growth. They can keep us out of growing. They can hold us in places where we just stay in one spot and we never really get there. We never really develop a relationship with God. I mean, they can even just like hinder your whole relationship in the sense that you just have this like constant state of fear or feeling like a lacking or different things like that. If you're somebody, so like using our divorce example, if you're somebody who doesn't believe in love, how are you supposed to accept that God loves you and wants to be married to you?
Yeah.
Like, how is that going to work? You can't, that doesn't just change. Like, I know that people will like argue that point, but that's not real. If your innate belief of love is something that is temporary, that's not going to change just because you got to know who God is. You might have parts of it. You might have some revelation that comes and like affects it, but that's a core thing that will still be there, and it will hold you, and it will put you in cycles with God, where you come to Him and you feel His love and you feel so much joy and goodness, and you feel like you can really just press into Him, but then something will happen that'll make you question it because there's a weakness there. And now that weakness has been triggered, you pull back and you start to wonder if what you experienced was ever real. And you start to think that maybe God isn't really there for you. And then you kind of pull back and you maybe start getting back into the world a little bit. But then you have another experience with God and you're just alive again. And then we repeat. We repeat. We do it again and again and again. It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, it doesn't have to be that way at all. Like, there's a reason why this message is attached to the Arsenal series, right? It's not just that you don't have to live that way. It's that you can actually flip the game on the enemy. See, there's a lot of stuff about like introspection, and I know that there's a lot of stuff about recognizing, letting God fight your battles. See, the thing about it is that you cannot, if you have these kinds of innate things, if you're stuck in a pattern, in a repetition, in a repetitive cycle of coming and going, or getting close and falling away, or struggling with concepts like love and faith and joy and hope, and and believing that God's for you. That if you're struggling in those places, and maybe you have like a relationship like that with the church, even where it's like you go there to a new church, you connect to the body, you feel loved, you feel connected, but then things start to happen, and like they start touching on those old nerves where you've been betrayed before, and you start to recognize the signs. So you start to pull away, and then you start to feel rejected because nobody's talking to you as much, because you're disconnecting, but you don't see it as you disconnecting. You instead you see it as them not reaching out to you, and then you just pull away entirely. You leave the church, and then you're gone. And then you're stuck, and you're alone again. And then you fall into darkness, personal darkness. But then you come back, and there's a new church. You go to that new church, and you do the same thing over again. It happens. It happens. Maybe you have to consider that those signs that you were seeing, maybe they weren't real. And I don't mean like those signs that you were observing things that weren't real, but maybe your past, or maybe these weaknesses, these places where the enemy has planted thoughts and processes, or has sat there and like sowed seeds of deceit. Maybe how you saw those things isn't how they actually were. Because see, the thing about it is in order to break free of these patterns and these cycles is to see them. You have to be able to recognize them. And that's the start, okay? That's the start of it. The start of breaking free of cycles is recognizing that they're cycles, is seeing the pattern, recognizing the pattern, acknowledging the pattern, accepting that you have a pattern, and not wanting it. If you see it and you just kind of accept it as it's just a part of your life, then you're going to be stuck in it. If you see it, accept that it's there, and choose to reject it, then we can talk. Because see, the thing about it is you don't need to be a dog returning to its vomit. You don't need to be a sow who's just been washed returning to the mud. You can absolutely be somebody who's washed clean and stay clean. You can be somebody who's able to move into new patterns, new cycles, healthy patterns. You can be broken free of generational cycles. You can be broken free of trauma cycles. You can be broken free of personal behavioral patterns. All of this stuff is not permanent. Your character is not permanent. Your personality is not permanent. There are parts of you that are meant to be there, but there are also parts of you that are going to have to be killed off. Because when you accept Jesus, when you come to him, when you surrender to him and choose to follow him, you also choose to give up your old life, your old you. That has to go. That's part of dying and being reborn, being renewed as a new person, a new birth. The whole concept of rebirth comes with this caveat that the old man has to die. You can't carry the old stuff into the new. The old stuff can't handle it. If you were a strong Christian earlier in your life, you got to let that go. You might be have come from a very religious background. Maybe you fell away. Maybe you didn't fall away. Maybe you just found a new church and it was alive with the Holy Spirit, and you grew in that and said, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. I get to actually know God instead of just read about him. And now you're running into all kinds of problems because you're hitting wall after wall. But that's because the old stuff's still there. You're still holding on to parts of who you used to be because you were a righteous person. It would be like Paul trying to go and be Paul, but still delighting in Saul of Tarsus. It would be like him having been a Pharisee and now trying to follow Jesus after the Pharisees were teaching him to kill Jesus. They can't be the same. You can't have them both. One can stay, the other's got to go. And that's where these cycle things, that's one of the ways in which we can destroy these cycles, is because when you have, like, for the familiar stuff, for the family stuff, for the behavioral patterns that you've existed in, for the trauma cycles, these are things that need to die. And I know, like, that the trauma one, it's hard. I understand that, because you're touching on something that's in your subconscious. I understand that that's difficult, but this is the way. It has to go. It has to be taken to God. It has to be surrendered. And maybe it has to be surrendered again and again and again. And there's a place to seek healing from that, to be free of that cycle, to have that broken off. That's a thing you need. We all need that. And the thing about it is that from there, we end up in this spot where, well, if we start to recognize our cycles and our patterns, then we start to find freedom from them. We start to find ourselves in places where we can create new patterns, new cycles, where we grow closer to God, where we push farther into the kingdom, where parts of us are growing and changing, and we create cycles of growth, patterns of growth. And this can be something that we can do aggressively. We can aggressively seek God in these places and move into patterns of, like, building on top of growth after growth. But sometimes we get into bad patterns. And that's something that happens as well. Sometimes the enemy will, because the enemy's not going to stop fighting you just because you broke free of the yoke that he put on your family, or that he put on you through trauma. He's going to keep coming back, and he's going to keep pushing that button because he knows that he can. And he's going to keep trying it to see if it's going to, like, work again. But therein lies where this becomes a part of our arsenal. See, when you know the cycles, when you know the patterns, you can actually use the patterns and cycles to entrap the enemy. See, years ago, one thing that I used to have a lot of different things that I would struggle with, but I also was aware of some of them. So I recognized some of my own patterns, some of my own cycles. And I knew that the enemy had, because the enemy's not, how do I put this? He's not completely unpredictable. It's the same way that, like, a shark that smells blood is not unpredictable. A shark that smells blood is predictable. It's going to become more aggressive. It's going to become more predatory. It's going to become more irrational. It's going to become more of a threat. The same is true of the enemy. If you have a weakness, he's going to do the same thing, and he's going to try to find a way back to that weakness. So if you recognize this, if you are aware of the thorn in your flesh, you can use that as a tool to draw him out. And even in those places where he is, like, trying to come at you, you can create cycles against the enemy. You can create cycles against Satan, against his demons, where you can actually foster a circumstance where you can pull them in to break them off of you. It's like baiting them. Or even if you can recognize the patterns, and this was what I used to do a lot, was where I would know that something was hit on, and having it be exposed, I would look at it and say, okay, well, this is what we're working on right now with God. Well, how is the enemy going to try to distract me away from that? Well, what's the next logical thing? Where's another weakness? Well, there's this one. And where's another weakness? Well, there's this one. So let's say that my pride is the thing that God's addressing. But I know that I also struggle with, like, judgment, because judgment's directly attached to pride. And I know that judgment is a thing that I would struggle with. So now the enemy, recognizing that pride is the thing that God is trying to address, I can move into a place where I'm also pulling up judgment as a thing attached to that we can now take to God and address both, or recognizing that that's there, but wanting to, like, stay focused on this thing that God's working on. I can know that that's ready and wait for the enemy to come at it, because he will. And then when he does, I know exactly who it is. I know exactly what's happening that day when I'm suddenly feeling like super judgy and I can't explain why. I know why. I immediately know this is the enemy. There's an attack against this thing, this part of me, that he is now trying to use in order to try to pull me away from what God's trying to do with me. And then I can address it, cast off the spirit, break that whole thing off. And yes, sometimes you can absolutely draw out the enemy with the weaknesses that you have. Because the thing about it is, you got to understand, is that Satan will try to protect his work. See, because the thing about it is as long as that weakness is there, as long as that damage is done, as long as that wound is left open, he has an opening to get to you. He has a place where he can get you into agreement with him. And that's a powerful thing for the enemy, for any demon, is agreement allows them attachment. If you agree with them in how you see something, or how you believe in something, if you agree with them in any way, shape, or form, they now have a legal right to cling on to you, to attach to you, because you have created a home for them in your person. And that is where they can attach, and that's where they can hold on to you. Now, this can be weaponized. This can be weaponized against them as well. If you know that the enemy is going to try to hunt you, and you know the weaknesses that they like to use, then you can use them as a sort of meter, a sort of way of gauging if they're around and if they're trying to attack, because they want to protect that thing, and if they have the chance to grab it again, they will. They absolutely will. Like I said, they're not unpredictable. It's almost like you took a little bit of blood, dropped it in the water, and said, okay, let's see if somebody's going to come and try anything. Let's see who's been sneaking around trying to attack me. And that's the thing, is like, this matters sometimes. And I know it seems like kind of obscure to do that. Like, why would you try to draw them in? It's not that you're trying to draw them in, it's that you're trying to draw them out. And in those instances, these cycles, these patterns are powerful tools that we can turn against them, because they use them against us. They build them. They spend so much time crafting this architecture. I mean, like when I just described how they would use, like, divorce as an example, pulling it all together, it's so convoluted. That's a lot of work. But that's the point. They don't like to do that much work. They don't like to do it again. They don't like to craft new things. If they've spent your entire life building a lie, manufacturing a train of thought for you that they're going to try to use for the rest of your life as a way to kind of like attach to you, they don't want to build a new one. They just spent 30 plus years building this thing, and now you're just going to toss it away? Now they can't have it anymore? Now that's miserable. The chance to have it back is too good. It's too good to pass up. So if you are under attack, or if you know things are off, if you can recognize that, like, there's moves of the enemy around you, you can use these things that they've created cycles around in order to draw them out, because they can't help it. And then when you've drawn them out, you can cast them off. You can break off the assignments that they have. You can do different things like that. But you can, all in all, you can defend yourself. You can break this off, and you can cast these spirits out, because you now have control over that cycle. If it's exposed and you have surrendered it, if you have died to that thing, you now have control. You can now create new cycles with God. And you can together, you can build a new pattern, a new normal, a new familiarity with the truth and with life in such a way. And in that, you can foster a relationship with God that's built on truth and love, and is free of the kinds of weaknesses that may have divided you from Him in the past. So yeah. So that's what I've got. There is a little thing here to add, though, and that is just this, like, if you're not aware of any of, like, the cycles in your family or the cycles that you have, I would propose that you should look into that. If you're not familiar with, like, we don't have to use the term generational curses if that makes you uncomfortable. Instead, we could simply say familiar patterns. So look at your family line. See if there are patterns of abuse. See if there are patterns of divorce. See if there are patterns of different sexual or physical sins. See what's there. Maybe it's not even that. Maybe there's a tendency towards lying or manipulation. Maybe there's stuff or pride. Maybe you have a family history of just proud people, and there's a place to see that, to recognize that. And this is the beginning, is to have this exposed so that you can then be broken free of this cycle. Trauma's harder in the sense that it's like harder to break free of, but maybe think about that too, like where the traumas have been. What times do you act out around the anniversaries of those traumas? Or are you haunted by those traumas? Because that's the thing, like, the enemy will demons will come to remind you of traumatic events in order to keep you focused on that pain, on that misery. That's where the intrusive thoughts come from. It's not just something that happens because it's just random in your brain. Your brain has created pathways, it's true, but you don't always have to use those pathways, you know what I mean? Like, your brain can use a lot of different ways, especially when you're thinking about things unrelated. And yet suddenly that just comes up out of nowhere. That's because it's been inspired. That's because there's a spirit there pushing that button. So think about these things. Think about the family stuff. Think about look at the trauma stuff. Look at your own personal lifestyle and patterns that you have. Think about, or even a better example is to ask friends. Have you noticed if I do if I have any weird patterns where I come back and fall back? What's my church life like? You can ask other people in order to get them in order to learn more about yourself. That's a thing. These are practical things, but they're things nevertheless to look at, to recognize, to understand, and to be able to then turn around and use, to surrender to God, and then be aware of in the future. But yeah, that's what I've got.